Well, happy June, everyone. I wanted to start with a little activity this morning. If you want to participate, just yell out your response, and if you loathe activities like this, just keep sewing. What does June represent for you? End of school, yes, it's true, end of school. And for parents, the last vestige of bedtime. I mean, it is so bright, so late. How many of you have heard, how can it be bedtime? It's still light out. Yes, like, there's no hope. It's just over. Call it. Sunset tonight is at 8:31, and it's light for another 90 minutes after that. What else do you think of with June? Pride Month, yes, absolutely. We just celebrated together as a community yesterday. And I have to say, just a plug, the Alliance and the vendors do such an amazing event for our local Chester County Pride that takes place in Phoenixville. Phoenixville has such a culture that's just like really beautiful, and it invites it into that, and the Alliance comes alongside of that, and the vendors come alongside of that, and it's a really beautiful thing. And I heard that the first year that we were there was 3 years ago. And that year, there were 3 churches present. And every year, there are more and more churches present. And I just want to say, like, amen, like as it should be. And I'm so grateful for that. And I hope that we can both, all sides, hold space for one another. That we can hold space for all of the people that exist in that identity, and that those people can start to hold space for, like, maybe this could be something that I could come back to, or I could come into for the first time. Maybe this doesn't have to be something that's, at odds with who I am, or doesn't something that's, reject me in the base identity of who I am. So, yes, a beautiful, beautiful event. If you've not gone, it is a really lovely Pride. Our whole family goes. It's very family-friendly. All-inclusive means all-inclusive. It is a beautiful day. Anything else in June? Summer, yes. Longer, warmer days. Yes, our serotonin-seeking brains are very happy right now.
Never-ending sweat.
That too. There is some sweat. Yeah, that's how you interpret it. Yes, that can be a good thing. Anything else? For Hallmark, what is it? Grads and dads. It's grads and dads season. I see that above all those greeting cards. Grads and dads. And yes, it is. It is grad and dad season. Anything else? Juneteenth, yes. Juneteenth on June 19th. Fireflies. What was that? Honeysuckles. Poison ivy, yes. All of that. Mosquitoes, yes. June holds a lot. S'mores, yes. I also think, historically maybe more so than right now, June used to be like wedding season. I think of weddings with June, partly because my wedding is in June, so that could be why. Thanks. And just a little plug, since I do have the microphone, and I do. This June, we are celebrating our 20th wedding anniversary. Look at us! And I know you're thinking he looks far too young to have been married 20 years, and you're right. But we were married as children, so not far from the truth. But yes, June is a month that holds a great deal of things. What a month. It's a good thing that it comes with those extra long days, the longest day of the year, because it gives us all that much more daylight in which to celebrate them. Well, today is also kind of a big deal here in Hebrews 11. We've reached the final by faith statement. Dun, 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 dun. Let's see if my clicker works. Hey! We've reached the final by faith statement. But don't get it twisted, because it's almost like the writer of Hebrews was in a June season of life himself, like the end of the school year. Like, at the beginning of the school year, you start out strong, or at the beginning of a paper, you start out real strong, and you're like, by faith, this, and by faith, this person did this, and by faith, this person did that. And then he or she gets, we don't know the author of Hebrews, the author gets to this point in Hebrews, and they kind of look back, and they're like, wait, this is all the farther we are? And it's almost like you can see the panic wash over their face between my verse 31 and Matt's verse 32 next week. Because verse 32 starts with, and what more shall I say? I don't even have time to tell you about, and just like lists a string of names with no stories whatsoever. And that is the voice of June. Phoning it in like, okay, yeah. And then we had these people. They did lots of things too. What do I even have time to say? But today is the final by faith statement. So, who do we think holds this esteemed honor? Well, last week we marched with Joshua around Jericho, as we heard from Reverend Sandra, but we didn't actually name Joshua, so perhaps it will be him. He is the successor to Moses after all, which is, kind of a big deal. And Moses was the last one to be named, so all of which makes Joshua a likely and worthy candidate. Or perhaps it will be David, King David. There's a very strong through line thus far in these by faith statements, moving through generations and genealogies. And we know the New Testament writers can't resist a good genealogical through line, with King David often being one of the main tent poles of their demarcation. Plus, by faith, David met Goliath on the battlefield and defeated him with a stone and a sling. Has a nice ring to it, making him a very strong contender. But none of those seemingly obvious frontrunners won the honor. And this just goes to show us, you never know who God will use. And with that, the envelope, please. The final by faith statement wasn't a king. Yeah, stick figures, they're back. I'm sorry, I'm supposed to read it first. I'll tell you who it is. By faith, Rahab, the sex worker, did not perish with those who were unbelieving after she welcomed the spies in peace. The final person recognized with the dedicated, set-apart, individualized by faith statement wasn't a king. They weren't a prophet. They were not a military leader or a leader at all. They were not a patriarch. No, she wasn't a man at all. She was a sex worker. And she wasn't an Israelite. She hadn't been delivered out of Egypt and walked through the sea on dry land. No, she was not part of the author's cultural in-crowd. In fact, she was part of the opposition. The squatters, as Reverend Sandra said last week, part of the Canaanites occupying the land that was promised to the Israelites. Furthermore, she wasn't part of the inner circle of Jericho either, neither figuratively or literally. So, who was she? Well, we meet her here in Hebrews, which is, confusingly a little bit, written in Greek. So that means it's time for Greek Grammar School, a crash course for Christians. Your favorite segment and mine. I do. Have it on speed dial. After our familiar pistis, by faith statement, we get Rahab, meaning wide, broad, ample, porne, harlot, whore. Rahab, porne. Perhaps an unexpected way to list someone, no less the final stand-alone someone in the hall of faith. But what else do we know about her? Well, I'm glad you asked. Rahab's life is recorded in Joshua, chapters 2 and 6, and she's remembered in Matthew 1, Hebrews 11, and James 2. So let's start with her history. So Joshua chapter 2, verse 1, and we're going to move all the way through chapter 2, if you'd like to follow along. Then Joshua, son of Nun, secretly sent out 2 spies from Shittim. Go look over the land, he said, especially Jericho. So they went and entered the house of a sex worker named Rahab and stayed there. Wait a minute. Is that what Joshua just said? Joshua secretly sent 2 spies and asked them to go look over the land. Okay, got it. So they went and entered the house of a sex worker named Rahab and stayed there. Nope, that was not what he said at all. But here we are, and you gotta love the Bible, and we do, we really do. This is not a great look for these 2 spies, and also not a glowing introduction to Rahab either. And there are those who wish to clean up this introduction, positing that maybe Rahab was more of an innkeeper. But Rahab's name in both the Greek and the Hebrew, which is the language now that we're in the Old Testament, and the Ugartic, which was her local regional dialect, all of those, her name means wide and open, explicitly sexual in nature by her very name. In the Hebrew, it's Rahab, Zana. Zana is a verb, and so it's a different tense. So like we translate it as harlot, but it's actually a verb, and this is directly from the lexicon. This is a verb that means, and I quote, go a-whoring. That is the translation of the word in the official lexicon. Feel free to look it up yourself. I couldn't make this stuff up. Go a-whoring. And equally explicit were the two phrases the author of Joshua used here for the spies who came into her house and laid there for the night. That last one being shachab, which means to lie, as in to lie of sexual relations, like he laid with his wife and then they had a child. If anything, it seems the author is leaning into her occupation rather than shying away from it or being ashamed of it. Verse 2, and here I'm going to stop with all of the slides this way, with the text, and I just want you to kind of listen and take it in as we go. So verse 2, if you would like to follow along, you're welcome to follow along in the Bible. Joshua, verse 2. The king of Jericho was told, look, some Israelites have come here tonight to spy out the land. They had one job. So the king of Jericho sent this message to Rahab, bring out the men who came to you and entered your house because they have come to spy out the whole land. Some spies, they have just arrived. And already they've been discovered, their plan has been discovered, and their exact location has been discovered and made known to the king of Jericho on the first night. Verse 4, but the women had taken 2 men and hidden them. She said, yes, the men came to me, but I did not know where they had come from. At dusk, when it's time to close the city gate, they left. I don't know which way they went. Go after them quickly, you may catch them. But she had taken them up on the roof and hidden them under the stalks of flax she had laid out on her roof. So the men set out in pursuit of the spies on the road that leads to the fords of the Jordan, and as soon as the pursuers had gone out, the gate was shut. Our heroine of the faith, lying to her king and committing treason to her country, all to hide these 2 Israelite spies she has only come to know this very day. Why? An important question. Why? Well, it's one whose answer may become more evident as we continue, so just put a little pin in that as we keep reading here. In verse 8, before the spies lay down for the night, she went up on the roof and said to them, I know what the Lord has given you this land, and that a great fear of you has fallen on us, so that all who live in this country are melting in fear because of you. We've heard how the Lord dried up the waters of the Red Sea for you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did for Sihon and Og, the 2 kings of the Amorites, the east of the Jordan, whom you completely destroyed. That passage, which is awfully specific and awfully flattering language to attribute to Rahab, as if she would know all of these very specific things they had done. But she is likely adept at the art of persuasion, so we'll give it to her. And the author continues in verse 11 with, when we heard of it, our hearts melted in fear, and everyone's courage failed because of you. For the Lord your God in heaven above and on the earth below. And this is our first clue. Fear. It's clear, at least from the recorded perspectives of the Israelites, and history is written by the victors, that the residents of Jericho are scared, from king to commoner. Twice Rahab is recorded as saying that they were melting in fear. And I'm sure we all know what a powerful motivator fear can be, right? I mean, fear is physical. Cortisol and adrenaline are released, your blood pressure and your heart rate increase, you start breathing faster, even your blood flow changes, flowing away from your heart and to your limbs, making it easier to throw punches or run for your life. So, is this faith? Or is it fear? Or can it be both? And can it be more? Can her faith take her fear and actually channel it into something else? Hope, perhaps. Could she capitalize on this moment of national fear and in faith see a path out of her personal fear? Could she be feeling all of these things? We are complex beings, after all. Well, let's see. Verse 12. Now then, please swear to me by the Lord that you will show kindness to my family because I have shown kindness to you. Give me a sure sign that you will spare the lives of my father and mother, my brothers and my sisters, and all who belong to them, and that you will save us from death. Our lives for your lives, the men assured her. If you don't tell what we are doing, we will treat you kindly and faithfully when the Lord has given us the land. So she let them down by a rope through her window, for the house she lived in was part of the city wall. She said to them, "Go to the hills so your pursuers will not find you. Hide yourselves there 3 days until they return, and then go on your way." And there is our second clue. For the house she lived in was part of the city wall. She lived out her life in the outer wall of the city, cemented into the actual outskirts of town. She was an outsider. She wasn't an outlaw, but she was an outcast. So what did she have to lose? And here, I believe, we're observing the actions of a survivor, of someone who's not lived under the stability of security, as someone who perceives a threat to herself and to her family and has been conditioned by their life and their life experiences to recognize and seize an opportunity for rescue when they see one presented. Because the wall wasn't there to protect her. For Rahab, the great walls of Jericho weren't a place of safety and stability. They were a place of immobility. She is doubly out. She's out from the Israelites and she's out from Jericho. She lives her daily life under threat. And then here comes another threat from the outside, perhaps an even greater threat to her existing threat. And so she senses and seizes an opportunity that quite literally knocked on her door. These two spies show up at her house. They're wearing sunglasses because they're spies. And they're really good spies, y'all. And whether by faith or hope or cunning or grit or desperation or some of all of that emotional buffet, she hides them up on the roof and then brokers a deal. Or to use their language, proposes a covenant. And this is a language in which the Israelite spies are fluent. Verse 17, "Now the men said to her, 'This oath you made us swear will not be binding on us unless when we enter the land you have tied the scarlet cord in the window through which you let us down, and unless you have brought your father, your mother, and your brothers and all your family into your house. If any of them go outside of your house into the street, their blood will be on your own heads. We will not be responsible. As for those who are in the house with you, their blood will be on our head if a hand is laid on them. But if you tell us what we are doing, we will be released from this oath you made us swear.'" Sound familiar? Yeah, it's a little contractual, but it's also absolutely the Passover. It's like the Passover was written all over this. Only she marks her window with a scarlet cord rather than her door with the scarlet blood of the lamb. But both of those are in order for her family to be spared from a great trouble. So in verse 21, "Agreed," she replied. "Let it be as you said." So she sent them away, and they departed. There's a little rope there in a window. A little hard to see, but they're now on the outside. And you better believe she tied that scarlet cord in her window. Because that scarlet cord was her lifeline. Her own rope to escape the walls where she had been firmly fixed in place. Grouted into the outer wall of life. Mortared into the margin. And these Israelite spies were at her window. And these Israelite spies were her window. A vantage point to a vista beyond life in the wall. They were a possible point of egress through which she could escape the wall and the system that had held her and her family firmly on the outside. Maybe, just maybe, if the Israelites took their place, she could take hers. Verse 22, "When they left, they went into the hills and stayed there for 3 days." Nailed it. "Until the pursuers had searched all along the road and returned without finding them. Then the two of the men started back. They went down out of the hills, forded the river, and came to Joshua, son of Nun, and told him everything that had happened to them. They said to Joshua, 'The Lord has surely given us the whole land. It's all in our hands. All the people are melting in fear because of us.'" Now, if we were going to grade this spying expedition, I do have some critiques. They were charged with going secretly Looking over the whole land. Partial credit, they did say specifically Jericho, so partial credit will be given here, even though they literally didn't make it past the outer wall and went straight to a sex worker's house. And to boot, they only escaped with their lives because of the benevolent behavior and brokerage of said sex worker living on the margins of her society. She received them. She fed bad intel to her king and fed the entirety of what little good intel they bring back to Joshua here, provided the plans and the means for their escape, and advised them on where and how long to hide in order to skirt the local search mission. Beyond that, they provide no intel whatsoever on possible access points or areas of vulnerability that could be used to strategize an attack. You know, like a spy. But I digress. Thank God for Rahab, or they may have wandered the wilderness for another 40 years. Fast forward to all that we read and studied last week with Reverend Sandra. Joshua received the orders and carried them out. They circled the city for 7 days, and on the seventh day, we pick it up here in Joshua chapter 6 and in verse 15. So Joshua chapter 6, verse 15. On the seventh day, they got up at daybreak and marched around the city 7 times in the same manner. Except on that day, they circled the city 7 times. The 7th time around, when the priests sounded the trumpets, Joshua commanded the army, "Shout, for the Lord has given you the city and all that is in it are to be devoted to the Lord. Only Rahab the sex worker and all who are with her in her house shall be spared, because she hid the spies we sent. But keep away from the devoted things so that you will not bring about your own destruction by taking any of them. Otherwise you will make the camp of Israel liable to destruction and bring a trouble on it. All the silver and gold and all the articles of bronze and iron are sacred to the Lord and must go into his treasury." And this part has nothing to do with Rahab, but this scene is giving me major Aladdin vibes, where it's like, touch nothing but the lamp! But again, I digress. Verse 20, when the trumpets sounded and the army shouted, all of that they miraculously remembered. It's a very long speech that he said, and shout this! It wasn't like a short little war cry. When the trumpet sounded and the army shouted, maybe they were just like, woo! And at the end, at the sound of the trumpet, when the men gave a loud shout, the wall collapsed. So everyone charged straight in, and they took the city. They devoted the city to the Lord and destroyed with the sword every living thing in it, men, women, and children, young and old, cattle, sheep, and donkeys. Verse 22, Joshua said to the 2 men who spied the land, "Go into the sex worker's house and bring her out and all who belong to her, in accordance with your oath to her." So the young men who had done this spying, air quotes, went in and brought out Rahab, her father, her mother, her brothers, her sisters, and all who belonged to her. They brought the entire family out and put them in a place outside the camp of Israel. Out of the path of destruction, but yet again on the outside. Only this time on the outside of the Israelite camp. Verse 24, then they burned the whole city and everything in it, but they put the silver and gold and the articles of bronze and iron into the treasury of the Lord's house. But Joshua spared Rahab the sex worker with her family and all who belonged to her, because she hid the men Joshua had sent as spies to Jericho. And she lives among the Israelites to this day. Did you see it? A pivot. She lives among the Israelites to this day. She doesn't live alongside them, she lives among them. No longer on the outside, but as an integrated part. And this is key. This is a textbook example of bounded sets versus centered sets. In Canaan, Rahab was bound in the outer wall of the city. This bounded set having literal bounds, as in walls. They were high, they were thick, so thick that she lived in them. And they absorbed the outer circle of society, and that is where those people lived. Sure, the king, or at least the king's men, could come to her, but she couldn't move toward them. In her day-to-day life, men came to her, but she could not move toward them. She was Rahab the sex worker, not Rahab the wife. Her movement was restricted. She was out, and she couldn't get in if she wanted to. Movement was a privilege of the powerful. But then she saw another way, a way out of out, to a God who made ways where there were no ways, to a God famous for his deliverance out of bondage, through seas, and into promised lands. Could it be? Could God do that for her? Could she really move? Could she move toward God? And so she takes a step and welcomes the spies. She takes another step and hides the spies and then delivers them out of her window. And she takes another step and ties that scarlet cord in the very same window, wondering if it will lead to her own deliverance. Deliverance to a place where she can take all the steps she wants. And that's what she did. She said, these boots were made for walking, and that's just what they'll do. And she walked right out of that bounded set of Jericho, its bounded wall and rubble, and she entered the camp of Israel. Yes, she started out on the outside of the camp. But y'all, this is the difference. She moved. She was given the freedom to move and to take steps. And she lives among the Israelites to this day. And while that is already more of an epilogue than we typically get in a story like this, in a book that never ceases to surprise us, we get a glimpse at a bit more with Rahab, thanks to those fascinating genealogical through lines those New Testament writers love so much. In Matthew chapter 1, verse 5, and this is in that genealogical, and so had so-and-so, and so-and-so, and so-and-so, all the way down to the birth of Jesus. In Matthew chapter 1, verse 5, we get this part. Salmon, the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab. Boaz, the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth. Obed, the father of Jesse, and Jesse, the father of King David. Rahab woke up like any other day. Trapped, stuck. Nothing extraordinary. But then 2 Israelite spies show up, and she makes a decision to receive them and to hide them. And that decision leads to the fall of Jericho, the entrance of the Israelites into the promised land of Moses, Jacob, and Abraham. It leads to marriage. Marriage with Salmon. It leads to the birth of a son, Boaz, which leads to Rahab becoming the other mother-in-law to Ruth. And it leads to Rahab, which the Bible repeatedly refers to as the sex worker, being the great-great-grandmother of David. Yes, that David, the giant slayer, the king, and the adulterer and the murderer, and the repentant and the forgiven. See, while they repeatedly refer to Rahab as Rahab the sex worker, no one is one thing. Identity is complexity. And just a reminder, we get all of these complex characters from Jesus, the Messiah's family tree. So if you ever think, can God work through me? I assure you, yes, God can, and yes, God is. And when we think that the work is small or insignificant, not particularly full of faith, remember Rahab the sex worker, welcoming spies in peace, made it into the Bible as the final by faith statement, worthy of its own place of recognition in the hall of faith. And to double down on that, James includes her as one of only 2 examples he gives in his chapter on faith, on the chapter of how faith without works is dead. He lists only 2 examples, Abraham, the patriarch of patriarchs, and Rahab, the sex worker. In James chapter 2, verse 25, in the same way, was not even Rahab the sex worker considered righteous for what she did when she gave lodging to the spies and sent them off in a different direction? As the body without the spirit is dead, so faith without deeds is dead. And yes, James also refers to her as Rahab the sex worker. They really don't let that go, even though she clearly had a life beyond that, a life with Salmon and Boaz, a life living among the Israelites to this day. And I love that she's woven into that family tapestry, not a fringe, but a scarlet cord that runs right through the center of it. right through David, straight on to Jesus, according to Matthew. And that's the beautiful, encouraging, and challenging thing. We don't decide who gets a seat at the table. We don't decide who gets a seat at the table. That's a beautiful thing when we're invited to the table, even when we may feel unworthy or undeserving ourselves. But it's also a challenging thing once we are at the table and we see who else has a seat. Really? Them, God? Yes, them. Perhaps when the 23rd Psalm says, "You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies," this isn't a gloating posture. See, when I was younger, that's how I read this. And to be honest, when I lived with a bounded set theology, that's just how I interpreted it. Like, I'm on the inside looking out, almost like this is a in your face to my enemies. But love changes us, doesn't it? Love invites us into a different space, a boundless space with the love of Jesus at the center. And so I don't read it that way anymore. Now I believe that in the presence of my enemies means in the presence of my enemies, as in they are present too. They too have a seat. In fact, the balance of this verse may allude to that very context. These are like little couplets in the poetry that is the 23rd Psalm. And this couplet together is, "You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup runs over." And I'm aware of 3 reasons that shepherds, like the one in the 23rd Psalm, anoint the head of sheep. And all 3 have to do with conflict, whether avoiding, minimizing, or healing after conflict. Like with an enemy. And my cup runs over is a clear illustration of there's enough. There's enough for you, and there's enough for them. No matter who you are, no matter what you've done, no matter where you come from, no matter where you live, you have a seat at the table. You have a seat at God's table, and you have a seat at our table. All of you, and all of you. And so does your enemy. And sometimes I think we're our own enemies, inviting parts of ourselves to the table when all of us is invited to the table. Because when we bring even the parts of ourselves that we don't like or aren't proud of, only then are those parts exposed to the love, generosity, and kindness of God. And that is what leads to repentance, wherever repentance is needed. The loving kindness of God will lead us there. I trust that because I trust God. But when the enemy is someone other than yourself, even there, remember, where you start doesn't determine where you finish. Rahab started as an enemy, but turned out to be an ally. Hold space for surprises like that. Because God is a wonder. A wonder. And love is more powerful than any of us know. And God isn't done with any of us yet. So let's keep those chairs and our hearts and our minds open, because you never know what seemingly small decision may lead to walls coming down, realized promises, and legacies of reconciliation and reintegration. And that's what the table is all about. Amen.